Just now in the class. Let me see if they're coming in. My name is Peter Rosset. I'm normally doing two things with my life. One is being an academic researcher at a research institute in Chiapas, Mexico called el Colegio de la Frontera Sur, or Territorial. Although recently I started being a visiting professor in Brazil, where I will be for the next year and a half. And I also work for La Via Campesina International, which is the global social movement of peasant and family farmer organizations in 80 countries in the world, in Africa, Asia, America, Europe, and the Middle East. And one of the things that's important in the struggle of peasants and farmers to defend rural life, small farmers, is to recover or rediscover more ecological ways of farming for a whole variety of reasons, which we're using the short version of the word agroecology to describe those other ways of farming other than conventional modern agriculture based on monoculture, pesticides, machinery, chemical fertilizer, commercial seeds, GMOs, etc. So I think that at this point in history, if we read either the academic or the popular literature, we can pretty much come to be convinced that peasant and family farm-based agroecological farming has a lot of advantages both to family farmers, or the families of farmers and peasants, to the environment and to society as a whole, including consumers and urban people, compared to industrial agriculture. And some of these reasons are that with ecological farming we have more healthy food, and if it's locally produced for local people, sometimes called food sovereignty, as we discussed in the class a little while ago. Revitalizing this kind of local production, ecological farming, maybe I should stay on the other side, is also a way to revitalize rural livelihoods and culture, to provide more opportunities for people to stay in rural areas. Agroecological farming is more resilient to climate shocks and to other external shocks. For example, agroecological farming is usually diverse, many different crops and animals on the same field, whereas modern conventional farming is usually a monoculture, a single animal or a single crop. And so when there's a climate change, when there's a new disease, if you have a single product, you can be wiped out completely. If you have a variety of different crops, animals, trees, then maybe some will be negatively affected and some even may be positively affected by, for example, a change in temperature or a change in rainfall. So given that we are faced with a rapidly changing climate and with all kinds of external shocks like new diseases, like price fluctuations, the kind of diversified production that ecological farming gives families provides a lot more resilience. Also, in terms of the total contribution to global warming and climate change that comes from the agriculture and food system, agroecological production has much lower greenhouse gas emissions. It turns out that if we do a greenhouse gas accounting, anywhere, depending on who does the counting and which figures they use, anywhere between 40 and 60% of all greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming come from our global food system. That means that the whole global food system, starting with the industries that make farm chemicals and fertilizers and ending up with the retail sale in supermarkets. So there's a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions that comes from petrochemical production of pesticides and fertilizers. Another part that comes from cutting down forests for monoculture plantations. Another part comes from monocultural production, leaving the soil uncovered instead of having been covered by vegetation, which allows emission directly from the soil. Another part comes from long distance transport. Instead of having a localized food system, we have a global food system that's moving towards everybody eating things produced in other countries and nothing produced in their own country. And so that dramatically increases the emissions from the food system. Then all of the transportation and distribution hubs of the supermarket chains and everything is a whole other source of greenhouse gas emissions. So when we add all of that together, we can say that the food system is one of the major factors contributing to climate change. And if we change to a localized and ecological, agroecological food system, that could be the largest single way to reduce emissions. Of course, other large single ways to reduce emissions would be to change to a mass transportation model instead of an individual car model, or to have serious controls on polluting industries. But one of the major possibilities would be to change the global food system. True agroecology, meaning that we, instead of buying inputs like fertilizers, even like biological food fertilizers, we use resources available on our own farm and our own community, can have much lower production costs for a farm family than conventional agriculture, where you have to buy fertilizer, you have to buy pesticide, you have to buy seeds, you have to buy machinery, you have to pay for irrigation water. And that can lead to much lower indebtedness, and indebtedness is one of the major problems that peasant families and family farmers face around the world, and it's probably the major cause of migration, abandoning the farm and migrating to cities around the world, and is the cause of a global epidemic of farmer suicides. In India, for example, official government statistics say that 300,000 peasants have committed suicide in the last 10 years, mostly because of indebtedness from all of those inputs that they need to buy for conventional agriculture. The United States also has a major epidemic of farmer suicides. For example, there's something called the Rural Coalition in the US that maintains a toll-free 24-hour-a-day number that farmers who have a crisis can call. And the major thing that they address is farmers wanting to commit suicide without losing the insurance for their families, because life insurance doesn't pay for suicide. So they call and they say, well, what if the mechanical harvester accidentally got in reverse and ran me over and killed me? Would my family get the insurance? And this is because the conventional model is so expensive in terms of production costs, and so unpredictable in terms of income, because prices go up and down and usually down, that the usual result is so much debt that eventually the family loses, the farmer loses their land. So agroecology, in cutting out most of those production costs, can dramatically reduce these kind of risks. It provides for much better stewardship of productive resources and biodiversity. Conventional agriculture with heavy machinery and monoculture and irrigation water, you'll lose all soil fertility within 10 or 15 years, and after 10 years you'll be applying 3 times as much chemical fertilizer as you did the first year in order to achieve exactly the same yield. 10 years later you'll be applying 5 times as much and only obtaining half of the yield that you had before. So conventional industrial farming methods are the opposite of sustainable. With agroecological methods, you can improve soil fertility continually and have ever more fertile soil, because you're always incorporating more and more organic matter into the soil and improving soil biology. And for peasant and family farmer families, it provides greater autonomy and less external dependence. What does that mean? For example, autonomy from the global markets for agricultural inputs. If you're not buying fertilizer, doesn't matter whether fertilizer prices go up and down. If you're not buying pesticide, the same thing. And if you're selling in a local farmer's market, at least partially controlled by your farmer organization, then you have more autonomy than if you're selling to the global market, where you have no influence whatsoever in any of the terms of trade. So for a whole variety of reasons, I think we can make a very strong argument that an agroecological farming system, a localized one, would be better for everybody. It would be better for consumers because we get healthier food. It would be better for farmers because they would have better livelihoods. It would be better for Mother Earth, for the environment. But it still isn't happening. And that's the topic of the talk today. Which way do I go? This way? No, this way. So, just some pictures to compare. These kind of, the modern industrial agricultural systems. Where do they come from? They come from places like the Midwest in the United States, which historically the constraints or limits to agricultural production were not enough labor, not enough people. There was lots of land and there was lots of capital, but there wasn't enough people, and if there were people, their salaries were too high. So that created a situation in which all of the incentives for innovation, science, and technology were to develop machines and chemicals, enabling very few people to work very large amounts of land, and that meant monoculture, meant mechanization, meant specialization, meant chemicals, and that has had already bad effects in the Midwest of the United States where it came from, and much worse effects when you take it to other countries where maybe they have lots of labor but they don't have any capital, but all this stuff costs a lot. And so the problems multiply when you start exporting this model to different parts of the world. And when you bring it to the kind of environments that peasants typically farm on, which are marginal environments for agriculture, may have problems with rainfall, may have problems with soil fertility, maybe on slopes, and you apply lots of fertilizer and it rains and the soil washes away, you very often start to create desertification and lose soil fertility, lose moisture, change climate patterns. And you end up in cases like this, when you bring herbicide and monoculture into environments that were never meant to have that kind of agriculture practiced in them. And we can compare those to those very similar environments where traditional agriculture continues to be practiced and hasn't been replaced by modern farming, and we can have something like that. We're talking about steep slopes, and if you put herbicide in it and destroy all the vegetation, and the rain comes and washes away all the soil, and then in the dry season, it looks like that. Traditional systems can and have been productive for, like for example, these terracing systems in Southeast Asia have been productive for thousands of years, and they continue to be productive as long as they're not replaced by these kind of systems. Typical peasant or family farm landscapes look like that. They're very complex. There are different uses. There's forested areas, there are intercropped areas, there are livestock areas, there's rotation, there's recycling, so the manure from the animals can be used as the fertilizer for the crops because they're in close proximity. Whereas in industrial agriculture, you may have one whole region that's all animal production and another region that's crop production, and it would be too expensive to truck the manure from one to the other, so you put it in enormous piles where it ferments and emits greenhouse gas emissions directly into the sky. And so, for example, in California, the number one air contamination problem is greenhouse gas emissions from confined livestock production. It's now overcome automobiles and industry as the number one cause of climate damaging emissions. Whereas if the older system that was in place in California, which was family farmers that grew their own forage and had their own cows, and the fertilizer went right into the soil and turned into the crops, which then the cows ate, has virtually no emissions. So you've taken a system that was fairly climate neutral and you've turned it into a climate devastating system. There's lots of ways to apply agroecological principles. For example, we have a lot of grape production for wine in this part of the world. Very unfortunately, usually you don't see that. Usually what you see is bare ground between it, where fertilizer is being applied, with all of the ills of modern agriculture being generated there, when just as easily it could have flowers that attract the natural enemies, that kill the pests that attack the grapes, that protect the soil, that avoid soil erosion, and that are incorporated into the soil and improve soil fertility. The only problem is that the fertilizer industry and the pesticide industry wouldn't be making any profits out of this, so we don't have agricultural universities promoting this kind of a system. We have them promoting the other kind of a system. Soil erosion is fairly easy to stop by using agroecological practices like planting along the contours, like planting living barriers to soil movement when it rains. But once again, many times this doesn't happen. Most of the time it doesn't happen, and we have the severe erosion that we saw on the other slide. So, but we can go even into very degraded systems with agroecological principles, putting organic matter into the soil, restoring soil biology. And unlike conventional agronomy, which cannot recover a degraded soil, can only put more fertilizer onto it, agroecological practices offer at least the hope of recovering some of the soils that have been damaged. One of the great things that traditional agriculture, peasant seeds, peasant agroecology offers for the world is a huge amount of genetic diversity. Modern agriculture, conventional agriculture, is very few varieties, often a single genetic variety over tens of thousands of hectares, and any single variety is adapted to a narrow range of climatic conditions. And so with climate change, if there's a temperature change or a rainfall change, we can have massive crop losses when we have a very narrow genetic base. And modern agriculture is almost always based on a very narrow genetic base, and therefore it's the most risky kind of agriculture if we're facing a changing climate. Peasant agriculture, on the other hand, conserves a huge genetic diversity of local seeds, of peasant and indigenous seeds, often even planting mixtures, genetic mixtures in a single field. And within that mixture, there's a range of possible adaptation to different levels of moisture, to different levels of temperature, such that as the climate becomes unpredictable, there's a certain homeostasis built into the peasant system because of the genetic diversity, which is one of the principles of agroecological farming. Here's an example of a farmer in Cuba, an agroecological farmer who has recovered from his neighbors, from grandparents, from elderly people in his municipality, and who plants, multiplies, and shares 128 different varieties of beans. So even having one agroecological farmer fascinated by collecting bean varieties can maintain the climate resilience of a whole municipality. And so it's incredibly valuable for even the human race to have peasant agroecological farmers who are performing this social service of maintaining and multiplying the genetic diversity that is the only way we can survive climate change as a population. So we have a major challenge: how to bring agroecology to scale. Because we have all of these benefits, but the sad reality is that the dominant model that's being promoted by extension services, by governments, by pesticide companies, by fertilizer companies, by advertisements on television, by the whole ideological apparatus of capitalism of the state, of the agricultural system, is keeping the net flow of more traditional farmers becoming modern farmers, as opposed to more modern farmers becoming agroecological farmers, which is the direction we want to go in. And very unfortunately, even peasant farmers around the world have been induced, often by credit programs or by government extension services, to give up their traditional practices and their traditional seeds and to adopt this highly risky and expensive modern agriculture. For example, in Mexico, where I've been living, there's a program called Kilo for Kilo, where the government encourages peasant farmers to bring 1 kilo of their native corn seeds, maize seeds, to a government office where they are burned and they are given as a gift 1 kilo of Monsanto corn seeds, which of course you can only use once. You can't save them because they're hybrids and they don't breed true. And so once you do that, you lose your stock of diversity of peasant seeds and you're hooked into the seed industry system. But that's not just Mexico. These kilo for kilo programs are all over the world. They're common in Africa, they're common in Latin America, they're common in Asia. And it's the giant seed corporations working together with governments using taxpayer money to induce the suicide of traditional farmer systems and seed diversity and its replacement by the narrow genetic base of commercial seeds. So, if we believe that it would be better to have agroecology brought to scale, meaning that it be practiced by ever more families over ever larger territories, then we have to address this dilemma. Apparently it's better, but it's not becoming the dominant model. So, this has become an issue discussed both in the academic literature as well as amongst peasant and farmer organizations and ecological farming movements. This bringing to scale or bringing to a territorial scale, and it's even been divided into scaling up and scaling out. Scaling out means over the territory, more and more families do it agroecologically. Scaling up means institutionalizing it, so it means changing the curriculum in agronomy faculties so they teach agroecology instead of conventional agriculture. It means changing the farm credit system so that governments give credit to ecological farmers and not just to conventional farmers. It means changing public policy to promote local farmers markets instead of giving tax incentives to supermarket chains. So it means the institutional part of scaling is scaling up, and the territorial part of scaling is scaling out, and obviously they go together. If you scale up and get an institutionalized support, then you'll be able to also to scale out more effectively. So there are key roles for peasant and family farm organizations and social movements in achieving both. And my particular job in Via Campesina, the International Peasant Farmer Movement, is to support our processes for scaling up and scaling out agroecology. And I believe, and we believe, that as organized peasants and family farmers, we are better positioned to do both of these things. We're better positioned to scale up because as mass social movements, we're able to put thousands of people in the streets, we're able to occupy government offices, we're able to protest, we're able to lobby, we're able to force and win more favorable policies or institutionalize more favorable policies. And because our membership are the families of the farmer and peasant families in the territory, we have the ability to consciously and systematically construct processes of horizontal learning in order to promote the scaling up by non-ecological farming families learning from ecological farmer families, and that requires social organization. One example that we use a lot inside Via Campesina, because it's one of the biggest success stories anywhere in the world, is in Cuba and Central America with a process called campesino a campesino in Spanish, or farmer to farmer in English, in which the idea is to make a break from conventional agricultural extension or technical assistance, because the conventional model is based on the idea that peasants and farmers are ignorant and their brain is empty, and they require a university-trained agronomist or technician to come and fill their empty brain with knowledge of how to farm, and that knowledge of how to farm then is usually conventional industrial agriculture. And rightfully so, peasants and farmers have become very suspicious and skeptical about what these agronomists come and tell them, because it's very clear to them that somebody who arrives to their farm in a Toyota Land Cruiser with Ray-Ban sunglasses and urban clothes may not have a whole lot of practical experience with farming, yet is coming with a whole discourse of how they should do everything differently. And so the conventional model spends really a lot of money. Governments spend a lot of money on extension services. Now it's becoming privatized, so now it's Monsanto who's spending a lot of money on sending technicians out to farmers. And thankfully, thank God, farmers are very skeptical about it, because things would be much worse if they just acritically accepted anything that a city person came and told them about how to plant their crops. Nevertheless, a lot of money is spent. Less effect is achieved. The effect that is achieved is a bad effect. So how do we change that? The indigenous peasants in Guatemala came up with the idea that farmers learn more quickly and are more likely to believe what other farmers just like them are doing rather than an urban person coming in a Toyota Land Cruiser or a Suzuki Vitara or whatever they use nowadays, or a Hilux. So what they did was develop a self-organized system to identify in the community those peasant farmers who are already using or still using, because of traditional practices, some kind of an agroecological practice that offers a solution to a problem that's very common amongst many other peasant families. So for example, if everybody has a particular pest problem, but there's this one farmer who still practices something that he learned from his grandparents or her grandparents of a particular plant that when you make a mixture out of it and spray it, the pest problem goes away, then the process exists inside the community organization to identify that family that has the solution and then organize visits to the farm of that family by all the families that still have the problem but who don't have the solution. So they go and they see it for themselves. They see, yes, indeed, it's a farm family just like us. And it actually seems to be working, and they actually seem to be living very well, maybe even better than us, and they can talk to them, they can taste it, they can touch it, and they're convinced. As they say in Cuba, seeing is believing. So it's not the same to have an agronomist come to their farm with a speech, with a discourse, and tell them what to do, as it is to visit another farmer or farm family just like them and see what they are actually doing and be able to actually see that it's successful. So the proportion of cases where people are actually convinced is much higher when it's farmer to farmer than in the conventional system. And in fact, it can be cheaper from an institutional point of view because hiring one university-educated extension personnel is very expensive, and they can only visit so many families per week, and you could only hire so many of them, and so in the end the budget limits the number of families that can be visited, and many of the families never get visited by anybody. Whereas when farmers get excited about a farmer-to-farmer process, they start racing ahead and finding out the visits that they want to do on their own, and there's a self-created dynamic that moves much quickly. So this system started in Guatemala, moved to Honduras, moved to Nicaragua, moved to Mexico, and then jumped to Cuba, where it was the most successful when the socialist bloc in Europe collapsed and Cuba lost all of its trade relations that it had with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Now, when Cuba had those trade relations, they were importing most of their food from Eastern Europe, and they were exporting tropical crops like sugar and citrus to Eastern Europe in order to import their food. And to grow their tropical crops like sugar and citrus, they were importing from Europe fertilizer, pesticide, tractors, irrigation equipment, mechanical harvesters. And so they were doubly dependent. They were dependent on the food, and they were dependent on all the agricultural inputs and machineries for that agricultural production they had, which was mostly geared towards export. When the socialist bloc disappeared, and when the United States intensified the economic blockade of Cuba, then they couldn't import any food, they couldn't import any pesticide, they couldn't import any tractors. Basically, they couldn't export sugar. They had to very quickly actually become self-sufficient in food production and actually do it without all of the inputs and machinery of modern conventional agriculture. It took a while. The first 10 years were very difficult. From about 1991 to 2000. In fact, there was a food crisis. People estimate that the Cuban population had a 30% drop in consumption of calories and protein. People were very thin. There were malnutrition diseases. But by 2000, they had discovered this campesino method in Central America, brought it to Cuba, and very systematically organized this process. Identify the farmers who are already doing it agroecologically, get everybody to visit them, match the problems with the solutions, and in a very short period of time, in fact 15 years between 2000 and now, they managed to get 50% of all of the farmers in Cuba now are ecological farmers. And it was very fast and effective because it was farmer-to-farmer learning and not top-down learning like conventional agricultural extension. So what we learned, and Cuba got a bigger success even than the Central Americans because they're more organized. The Cuban Peasant Organization, which is a member of Via Campesina International, and NAP, the National Association of Small Farmers of Cuba, is very organized. They're organized, all of their members belong to cooperatives. All of the cooperatives are linked together at the municipal level. All of the municipal levels are linked together at the province level. All the province levels are linked at the national level. They have a high level of internal training systems already in place. And so they were able to, in a very systematic way, apply this farmer-to-farmer, campesino-to-campesino methodology and get a much faster and much larger result than the less well-organized examples of peasant organizations in Central America before it. So, the degree of social organization, oops. In social movements like La Via Campesina, we call this organicity, or comes from Spanish organicidad, or Portuguese organicidade, is the degree of organizational tissue fabric inside the organization. That is the culture medium on which agroecology grows and spreads. And so I can say it to you this way, that if I'm a part of a peasant family, and for whatever our own reasons are, we give up conventional farming and we become ecological farmers, if we don't participate in any kind of a social network or process or organization, there's no systematic way that we're going to have a multiplier effect. There's no systematic way anybody's going to learn from us, find out about us, want to be like us, except maybe the immediate neighbors, or just by pure chance somebody finds out about it. On the other hand, if we're part of a very well-organized process of identifying the families that are farming ecologically and rapidly organizing visits by other families to learn from them, then the fact that me and my family became ecological farmers, we can have an immediate multiplier effect at the territorial level. And so that's why we say that the first ingredient, the most important ingredient, the culture medium, like in a petri dish that agroecology grows on, is social organization. And in order to make it grow in that culture medium, you need to have social process methodology. And the campesino-a-campesino method is an example of a horizontal social process method that builds peasant protagonism as the driving force. It's really important, this item of peasant protagonism, because what happens in conventional agricultural extension or technical assistance is that when the urban agronomist comes and has a meeting in the peasant community and teaches the peasants how to do modern farming, typically there's no dialogue or interaction. Typically the peasants look at their feet and don't say anything, and don't listen very much, thankfully also. But they're very polite. But nobody is like excited or motivated to do anything. It's kind of like a down, demobilizing experience. On the other hand, once a peasant-to-peasant dynamic gets started, and people, if I develop an ecological practice and suddenly my organization is bringing dozens of other families to visit my farm, I feel great. I mean, I really feel motivated. And that makes me more creative. It makes me want to innovate new things, or go interview my grandfather and grandmother and find out other things, or find another seed variety. So I'm becoming a protagonist. I'm excited. And this process becomes self-catalytic because of this, because the protagonists in the process are peasants and farmers themselves and not external agents. So when it's external agents, it's demobilizing. When it's peasants and farmers themselves, it's mobilizing. And so that's why we say that building the peasant protagonism in the process is one of the key factors. And in Via Campesina and in my academic work, we are doing a lot of self-study of our successful cases like the Cuba case to find what are the secrets of success. Why in some cases ecological farming explodes over a territorial level, and why in other cases 50 years later it's still only 5 or 6 families and there's still thousands who are doing it conventionally. What's the difference? So one of the differences is is if there's no fabric of social organization, nothing spreads. Second, if there is that, it doesn't spread very much if there's no conscious methodology to accelerate the spread and to get peasants to become protagonists. So those are two of the ingredients in making it spread. So we have in Via Campesina, we have a global agroecology process which is based on horizontal exchanges and also on peasant and farmer agroecology schools. So farmer to farmer is like a school without walls. The classroom is the farms of other farmers. We also have schools with walls, which are just another space where farmers come to learn from other farmers, and where it's other farmers who are the teachers, and then other farmers come to learn. So really they're both variants of the same thing, of farmers teaching farmers or peasants teaching peasants, learning from each other, horizontal. What we call diálogo de saberes, or dialogue amongst different knowledges. So through both of the self-study process in Via Campesina and also through the academic work, we have a group at Ecosur in Mexico called the Academic Group to Study the Massification of Agroecology, where we look at these cases around the world. We've come up with what we feel are like the key factors that have explained why some cases are successful and others are not successful. And this is important because we have the opportunity in a social movement like Via Campesina to consciously, intentionally, and systematically design processes. Because we're all organizations, we're not unorganized people. Everybody in Via Campesina is an organization or a member of an organization. So we're only talking about organizational structures. We're only talking about the culture medium that has the potential. And then how are we going to make something grow in that potential? Let's study what are the key factors and then see how we can plan them into the new processes. Because if we look at Via Campesina as a whole, Via Campesina is in 80 countries around the world, Africa, Asia, America, Europe, Middle East, about 200 million peasant and family farm families, 25 years old. When Via Campesina started, almost all of the organizations did not have agroecology or ecological farming on their agenda. They were demanding more credit to buy more tractors and more fertilizer, more pesticide, and more conventional seeds for the members of their organizations. Over the 25 years of Via Campesina, that has changed completely. The organizations have become completely disillusioned with the conventional farming model because getting credit, first of all, nobody wants to give credit to peasants. Bank privatization means it's impossible, but even if you do get it, they just get indebted and then they lose their land. Even if you do get chemical fertilizer, you just lose your soil fertility, you just go broke. You can't, as poor people, if you try to use the conventional capitalist model, you're competing with agribusiness farmers and they're producing the same products where in a game, the game being modern industrial agriculture, where the rules of the game favor whoever has more capital. That's the winner. Whoever can invest more in machinery, chemicals, blah, 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 is going to win the game. Peasants are never going to win that game. So we need to change the game, right? And we need to change the game away from conventional agriculture. And that's why most of the organizations over this 25-year period have come to at least rhetorically, discursively, and in terms of their utopian vision, want to get to agroecology as opposed to get to modern agriculture. That doesn't mean the reality is there yet, but the desire is there. And so maybe about half of our organizations already have processes like Campesino, like peasant agroecology schools, and the other half of the organizations are currently trying to plan how they're going to do it. So to the extent that we can identify the important factors, we have all of these organizations who are right now planning their processes for how they're going to promote and facilitate their grassroots members to go through an agroecological transformation. So that's the why of trying to identify these factors. So as I mentioned, the first two factors, social organization, horizontal social process methodology, and peasant pedagogy, meaning that peasants have ways of sharing knowledge that may be different from the way we're sharing it right now, where professors in front of the room going blah, blah, blah with a PowerPoint. The pedagogy has to be different. And so there's lots of peasant pedagogy being developed through all of these processes, and there's a similar process to look at all the pedagogical practices. Peasant protagonism, so there's a tendency in the organizations that's a hangover, a leftover from when they all wanted credit in conventional agriculture, to try to get money from government programs to hire technicians to teach their members how to do agroecology. And quite frankly, that usually doesn't work and ends up in a lot of money being wasted, because agroecology is really just a simple set of principles, but the way that you apply it is completely different in every local reality. And the only way to adapt the principles to local reality is to stimulate local creativity. And you never stimulate local creativity by having outside people come in and treat people like idiots and tell them what to do. So we have to break with that idea that some of the organizations still have, that the way to get to agroecology is to get money and hire technicians, and get to the point of understanding that the process works much more fluidly and much more effectively when it's peasants themselves who are the protagonists and not the external agents, even if the external agents are hired by the peasant organization. We have to have farming practices that work. We're not going to get everybody to adopt a particular practice that has no effect whatsoever because somebody says it works when in fact it doesn't work. But campesino and campesino as a methodology really takes that into account, because farmers are visiting the family that already practices it, and they are seeing with their own eyes what the result is. And believe me that if they don't see anything that looks like it's a good result, they are not going to do it on their own farm when they go back. And so the principal element in the process automatically is a self-selecting process that's always selecting the practices that work better. And then therefore, because they work better, they're much easier for people to want to copy them and try them out on their own farms. Turns out that in these processes, the organization has to motivate people too, to the extent that you have a discourse, or what sociologists call framing, that gets people excited and makes them want to do it. It really helps a lot. Inside the campesina, we have a lot of different cultures and different political cultures and different ethnic cultures, different cosmovisions. So for example, in the organizations that self-identify as indigenous people or original peoples organizations, we will often see that the motivating discourse that they use for their agroecology process has to do with Mother Earth and with the cycles of the moon and with the sacred symbols and with the life that's inherent in every object and all of the different indigenous belief systems. And living in harmony with Mother Earth, and Mother Earth is the home of all of us, and we can't do damage to her, we have to take care of her. And so this is the kind of discourse or framing of agroecology that works really well and is used by most of the indigenous peoples organizations. We have a movement in India, which is very successful in mixing agroecological principles with Hindu mythology. And we have very politicized organizations, political movements like the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, and the ANAP movement in Cuba, that are very successful at motivating already very politicized people with discourse about socialist values and revolution and things like that. So it can be many different things, but what it has to be is something that resonates with the people who have to be motivated. So each organization really comes to its own motivating discourse, but it's very important, that discourse. That's one discourse, which is towards their own members, because for me to try something new, I have to be motivated to try something.